Peace and understanding, class. Good morning. Wanted to reach out to you to bring a little clarity into position as it relates to class. This video is just an effort to kind of close the gap as we bring to an end the chapter 19, New World and New Ways of Thinking. As you know, we've talked about how Europe chronologically developed from the Dark Ages, the, the Renaissance era, as well as the season known as the absolutism in Europe, where they were striving to create governance, and ultimately the religious reformations with the Protestant Reformation breaking away from the Catholic Church. And now we have arrived at the era of the age of reason, the Enlightenment movement, as well as the scientific revolution. And again, I want to just reiterate, when I talk about the scientific revolution, I'm not stating the fact as a revolution in the typical sense of the word. We know that a revolution relates to warfare. However, in this sense, as I defined in class, that revolution means a sudden change, an abrupt or drastic change. And this was a change for information and a change of ideas that were more or less theoretical instead of practical. So we talked about a plethora of things, the Aristotelian universe, Copernicus. We talked about Sir Isaac Newton. We talked about the law of planetary motion and how these different theories came into play. You should have all of this in your notes. Also, we talked about facts, opinions, and a plethora of information as it relates to logic. So today I want to just give you some additional facts that you will need in closing out this chapter. And we will, again, I want you all to check the announcement section on Moodle. There you will see where I have given you a reminder of when something is due and when the test is. So we won't have any misinformation when it goes out to these type of things. So I first wanted to introduce you to another section of the Age of Enlightenment with a group of Frenchmen, and they were called philosophie. And that is a French word for philosopher. This term arose in France as the Enlightenment model began to spread throughout Europe. These philosophers indeed were asking fundamental questions about life, God and human nature, good and evil, and cause and effect. These people had the assertion that they were the ivory tower of knowledge. They were the elites in France, and they strive to learn of scholarship and academia. And they characterize themselves as the truly enlightened public, and those that were not as literate or in the know, they were called the blind and noisy multitude. And again, we can look at that and see that these ideologies or these classifications amongst people, as we talked about with Gutenberg and the press, how this revolutionized the transmission of information, because for the most part, the high mass of people were illiterate. There was not a great amount of people who knew how to read or write. So it was the religious leaders and the nobles and the aristocratic parties, these aristocrats, the well-to-do. In America, we would call them the 1%, those who control the finances and the economy. So that is important, and I want you to keep that in mind. The enlightened public and the blind, noisy multitude. The philosophies came into existence around the same time that here in America in the 13 colonies, around 1775, when the American Revolution was evolving and occurring. So this is very important. I needed to point that out to you as well. In addition to that, there is another gentleman that arose in France, and his name is Voltaire. And Voltaire was a philosophical and religious radical. According to the text, Voltaire often challenged, directly or indirectly, the Catholic Church and Christian theology at almost every point. Though he was considered by many devout Christians to be a shallow blasphemer, Voltaire's religious views were influenced and quite typically mature enlightenment. Voltaire clearly believed in God. However, he took the position that God was this masterful clockmaker and that he was omnipotent and skilled, and that the universe and his creation of mankind was a perfect creation, that God created this instrument and allowed it to work on its own, that God was distant, and that God does not interfere with his creation because he made it perfect. That is a very poignant position to look at. As we've looked at several different beliefs, I mentioned Spinoza, who asserted that God and nature were two different names for the same thing. If you look at that, you can see nature, how he arrived at that nature is a giver of life. It brings forth sustenance. Things grow, they die. The sun radiates heat and allows that whole process in the ecosystem that is very important for sustaining human life. But Voltaire had a deistic God, the great clockmaker, who created and built an orderly, perfect universe and stepped aside to let it run. Voltaire also believed that oftentimes, and he had a great disdain for religious intolerance. He believed that religious intolerance brought about savage and fanaticism. Look at that today as you see people arguing worldwide. There is a great historical account of people who are at war, bloodshed, the loss of human life, the demise of people over the belief of the unknown, over the belief of the unseen, of that which cannot be actually known other than through the concept of faith, which is a personal issue. That should not be anything that should be thrust upon any individual. So that is Voltaire. He is very important, and I want you to grasp that central theme. Secondly, I want to touch again on John Locke. We know his position and what he did, and he is very important. Another gentleman that was a contemporary of him is David Hume. And Hume argued that the human mind is nothing but a bundle of impressions. These impressions originate through sense experience and our habits of joining these experiences together. Reason, therefore, cannot tell us anything about questions that cannot be verified by sense experience. Now, this kind of put Hume in a position that rationalism, he was somewhat of a proponent against rationalism per se, based on these remarks. But again, we know that John Locke talking about sensationalism and experimental method with the utilization of the five senses, sensation, that man can know a thing from seeing, hearing, smelling, touching, and verified. I said that a fact is a phenomenon that can be observed for anyone who wishes to see it, but it can be verified. I gave the example of I can know one's date of birth by simply subtracting, knowing your age, by simply subtracting your date of birth from this current time and arrive at your age. That's a fact. It's proven, it's verifiable, and it's ongoing. So Hume was somewhat of a paradox to the whole ideology of reason. In addition to Hume, I need to mention to you the great Frenchman Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who, like other Enlightenment thinkers, talked about the commitment of individual freedom. In these times, we began to look at, as I stated, how Europe strived to create system of governance for themselves in the era of absolutism. And I said that John Locke said that the purpose of the government was to secure the needs of the people, and that the people have the right to overthrow any government that was not meeting their needs. Rousseau developed the social contract, and this is important because you will see this on your quiz. According to Rousseau, there are two fundamental concepts. Number one is known as the general will, and number two is popular sovereignty. The general will consists of the ideals and the wants of the people, not so much the majority, but in displacing a monarch, the people hold sovereign power. So the general will is the wishes of the people, what the people want. According to the text, it said that the general will is not necessarily the will of the majority. However, at times, the general will may be authentic, long-term needs of the people as correctly interpreted by the far-seeing minority. That's important. And popular sovereignty is self-explanatory. As we know, when I define the term sovereign, sovereign means to be independent. Sovereign means to be self-governing. Sovereign means to be free. Okay, so that's important. That is Jean-Jacques Rousseau with the social contract. In addition to the social contract, there was a great explosion in Europe, which now that the masses begin to strive in the way of age of reason, in the age of logic, striving for rationale, looking at the cause of law, cause and effect, looking at the human condition, human nature, wanting to understand this vast universe and understand how it operates, wanting to understand how the universe functions in a mathematical and logical sense, not based on myths and conjecture. So this era was called the Reading Revolution. That's great, because more books and recipients of books were spread throughout France and Europe. And scholars deem this era the Reading Revolution. This is a time when more people that witnessed a greater consumption of books, while with a modest increase of literacy, the upper class still maintained the higher access to information and controlling information. As I said, the Catholic Church with Galileo and his text, the two governing forces, I'm not saying the title correctly, but in 1666, Galileo was jailed and charged with being a heretic for his position and his literature. And the Catholic Church ultimately began to censor information. So we're looking at transitioning from that period, the censoring of information, onto a more favorable time into the era of the Reading Revolution. Reading became individual, silent, and rapid, and the well-educated classes were insatiable readers. So instead of having a group of people being told what a particular document says, being told the interpretation of what a document says, they had the autonomous ability to comprehend it for themselves, to break it down for themselves. So that is another important era that we need to look at within this chapter. Very important. In addition to that, this chapter has focused on the complex development of the New World in Europe and in Western society. The new view of essentially critical and secular, drawing its inspiration from the scientific revolution and crystallization in the Enlightenment. Decisive breakthroughs in astronomy and physics in the 17th century demolished the medieval synthesis of the Aristotelian philosophy, and Christian philosophy had only limited practical consequences despite expectations of scientific enthusiasts. Yet the impact of new scientific knowledge on intellectual life became great. Interpreting scientific findings and Newtonian laws brought about great change in the Enlightenment era. This new method, they believe, promised not just increased knowledge, but even the discovery of fundamental laws of human society. This is important. That is the gist of this chapter. And in addition to what we've gone over, I will go over again tomorrow in my 9:30 class, and again on Monday with my 9, 10, and 11. Encapsulate this information and bring it home. But you should continue to read and continue to study this information. Very, very factual, poignantly things that are here. Francis Bacon, empiricism. Sir Isaac Newton, gravity. Johann Kepler, Tycho Brahe. All these are Aristotle, Plato, Socrates. All these events, I alluded to the fact that Socrates studied in Kemet or Egypt for 22, or Aristotle for 22 years. Plato for 13 years, Socrates for 15 years, Hippocrates for 7 years. 7 years studying in Kemet, in Egypt. Again, Kemet means land of the blacks. This is where the great scrolls in the sacred library was that encapsulated a mammoth, paramount amount of information. And it has been recorded that Aristotle stole several books and went back to Athens in Greece and started his own school of philosophy. The Greeks are notorious for plagiarism and whitewashing and creating a revisionist narrative about true history. But historians research, analyze, and interpret, and oftentimes the interpretation is flawed. Research is a systematic approach to obtaining information about phenomena. That's what research is. So again, in closing, I want you to think about these two questions. How did this new world of view affect the way people thought about society and human relations? What impact did this new way of thinking have on political development throughout Europe? We see the connection between religion and leadership, and then a breaking away from some things. As I said, the philosophical community called those who were fanatics a cult. And I said that the term occult means mythical, superstitious, or the belief in some magical practice. Occult. So sometimes we misconstrue the term cult. When you hear that term thrown out loosely, oh, this person or that person is in a cult. Based on the definition of the English language, epistemology, and the etymology of the word, if you believe in supernatural powers or some form of magic occurring, and magic could mean, however you choose to define magic, you know what magic is. But if you believe in those type of things happening, then based on the definition of that term by the Webster Dictionary as well as Wikipedia, that is a cult. So let's continue to study. Let's push home strong, and let's finish the deal. In closing, again, I want to say that we continue to study Europe's position, and taking a strong Eurocentric stance in these survey textbooks. I've sought, it has been my agenda, to try to put you in a position to win and learn something about yourselves, your contributions as well. Oh, I forgot to talk again. You definitely need to know about the Moors, what the term Moor means, how that affected the Iberian Peninsula in 711. The Iberian Peninsula is Spain. I told you that the Moors went into Spain. Moor is a Greek word that means black. But the Moors in this case were African Muslims. But all Moors are Muslims. But all Moors are black. So with that being said, you look at some of the contributions, how people from Africa aided Europeans out of the Dark Age in great instances. In other societies as well, we talked about China with gunpowder and paper and magnetic compasses. We talked about the Incas and the Aztecs with the calendars that they created. We talked about our contribution, how the Muslim came in and were master pharmacists. This was greatly needed in Europe that had come out of a time of superstition, stagnation, disease, and poor climate, and warfare. Okay, guys, handle your business, and we will see you tomorrow. Peace.